Okay. All alerts have been cleared. Just let me know when to go.
I'd like to welcome our online audience and our speaker for today to the Bade Museum and ARF at UC Berkeley's online talk series. I'm Aaron Brody, director of the Bade Museum at Pacific School of Religion. I would like to take a moment to highlight our theme for this year and to briefly discuss how our series promotes social justice issues through meaningful dialogue. The Bade Museum is an institution dedicated to advancing knowledge of the archaeology and history of the ancient Levant. Over the course of the last few years, we at the museum have realized that such knowledge is enhanced by reflecting on and engaging with perspectives that have been largely ignored by modern day society and, as a result, have been erased from mainstream historical narratives. The Bade Museum particularly welcomes scholars like our scholar today, who are presenting marginalized perspectives that contribute to creating better equity in scholarship and society more broadly. This series, Disability in the Ancient Middle East and Mediterranean, lifts up the experiences of people with disabilities whose voices have been typically overlooked in the study of the ancient world. This program bridges the past and present through the study of disability in antiquity, its contemporary reception, accessibility, and its continuing impact today, contributing to a more nuanced, inclusive, and complete narrative of the past. I'm just about to share my screen to appeal to you as our audience to help support this online talk series. So just bear with me as I do the command to share. Just 1 second. So you guys have a better view of the URL. Sorry, just a moment. I have to. Okay. So I'd like to ask you to please image this QR code, which I have displayed below, and make a donation to sustain our online educational programming like the talk today. No donation is too small. We've gladly accepted donations from $5 to $5,000. Please also share the link on your social media to help advertise this online talk series. And just briefly, there is the QR code. Thank you guys very much. Thank our audience. And I'm about to stop sharing right now. And I'll yield the floor to my colleague, Melissa Craddock.
Thanks, Aaron. Hello, my name is Melissa Craddock. I'm Assistant Director and Curator at the Bade Museum, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Ella Karev is Senior Lecturer in Egyptology at Tel Aviv University, specializing in the legal, social, and economic history of ancient Egypt. Her research, based on Aramaic, Greek, Demotic, and Coptic papyrological evidence, focuses on enslavement and personhood in the late Ptolemaic and Roman periods in Egypt. She earned her PhD in 2022 at the University of Chicago on the topic of slavery in late period Egypt, and the book is now available through Zaphon Press. Dr. Karev's first book, which she will be discussing today, is titled Physical Descriptions, Biometrics, Iconographia, and Greco-Roman Papyri from Egypt, and it's published by Brill in 2024. Dr. Karev will be presenting on the topic of restrictions on a driver's license, the reception of disabilities in official identification from Greco-Roman Egypt. Ella, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Aaron. I'm going to share my screen, and I hope you can all see it. Give me a thumbs up if you can. So hello to all of you, and from a very rainy Tel Aviv. And if you see me looking off to my side here, that's because I do have a second monitor, so that's the reason, and it's not because I'm willfully ignoring you. Thanks to the Bade Museum and Aaron Brody for the invitation to come and speak with you today, and for all of you for being here to hear me out. So today I will discuss the physical impairments noted in formal identification in the Greco-Roman period in Egypt. And for that, and to clarify why I called this talk Restrictions on a Driver's License, I really need to delve into what I mean by formal identification. So formal identification was the focus of my book that came out last year, titled, as said already, Physical Descriptions, Biometrics, and Iconographia in Greco-Roman Papyri from Egypt. Yes, it's a mouthful, but I wanted to avoid the post-colonic. I'll explain a little bit about the subject of that book more generally, and then dive into the topic of impairments and disabilities, which also expanded to become a chapter in an edited volume separately from the book. So papyrologists, that is to say specialists in papyri who work with Greek texts from Egypt, will inevitably encounter or stumble upon an official physical description of an individual. And that looks something like this. Now, my focus as a scholar is more generally on enslavement. So on seeing one of these descriptions, I was just so curious, and I wondered if the descriptions of enslaved persons were the same as those of enslaved persons. But I found out pretty quickly that the comparison I wanted to make was more or less impossible, because none of the 3 books written on the topic from 1968, 1924, and 1922 did not collate all of the descriptions in one place. Perhaps unsurprisingly in their historical context, the 2 books from the 1920s were also overwhelmingly focused on the use of physical traits as racial markers and were highly racialized. So I set out to collect the data, initially kind of as a scholarly exercise, but the data set grew. And when I say grew, I mean really exploded. Nearly 4,000 descriptions of people as recorded on nearly 1,300 texts from the 3rd century BC to the 3rd century AD. And when collecting the data, it became obvious these descriptions worked as a system. I was able to track individuals across truly decades based on their physical descriptions alone. So suddenly modern studies on things like population tracking and documentary identification and yes, biometrics became relevant. Now, when you hear biometrics, you probably think about fingerprint scanners or retina scanners, or maybe something called like a biometric ID card that has a little chip embedded into it. But in effect, all biometric systems, including those ones, are rooted in the recording, measuring, and cataloging of physiological characteristics, which are related to the appearance of the human body, with the ultimate goal being, yes, identification. Now, biometrics as we know it today can be roughly divided into 2 types, right? We have hard biometrics, which rely on unique physical attributes like a fingerprint ridge, and soft, semantic, or light biometrics, which rely on data that isn't necessarily unique, like blue eyes or whatnot. And in both forms of biometrics, the traits used for identifications are used as modalities. Now, modalities by themselves, which is to say unimodally, are useful, but they're much more useful multimodally, which means to say several modalities combined. So for example, identifying someone by a singular modality like blue eyes is much more effective when that person is identified multimodally, not just blue eyes, but like blue eyes, tall, straight hair. It's important for our discussion today that biometric identification systems are characterized not only by their use of biodata, this data that comes from our physical form, but also for the secondary step of the process, right? Which is the comparison of the individual in question, the biodata on their identification, and a database of such data. So for example, right, in a fingerprint scanner, the scanner compares the scanned fingerprint with known fingerprints to confirm identity. If the fingerprints being scanned have not actually been correlated to an identity, the scanned fingerprint doesn't serve its purpose as a method of identification. Now, the invention of biometrics is usually credited to one man, Alphonse Bertillon, a French police officer and clerk, and arguably a terrible police officer, but a pretty good clerk. He joined the police force in 1879 and became concerned with the fallibility of the system to identify recidivists. he attempted to solve this particular problem with a technique that came to be known as Bertillonage. Of course, his name. A record of 10 specific measurements of each apprehended individual alongside a photograph and word-based, oops, I went too far ahead. I gave you some spoilers, a word-based or what is known as lexical description. Bertillonage was eventually abandoned in favor of fingerprinting, but you may or may not know, Bertillonage lives on. And not only because Bertillon invented the mugshot, which you can see here. The lexical description, the list of words of physical traits, are now called, and I quote, civil soft biometrics. And elements of this are familiar to you with an American driving license. This is the spoiler I gave you, or maybe anyone who held a passport in the 80s and 90s, particularly a European passport. I'll get to it. Bear with me. Those of you with an American driving license know that they include measurements of height and weight, hair color, eye color, and any impairments that impede driving abilities, like the need to wear corrective lenses, and even get down to the point of having your organ donation status. Now, this may come as a surprise to anyone who is not American, right? Because those ID cards do not come with those kind of details at all, and usually just only include a sex at birth and a date of birth. The physical descriptions in American driving licenses, if you are curious, and I was, are a holdover from the pre-photograph days, because without a photograph, identification was through lexical, word-based description alone. So early passports, much like American driving licenses, do I not have my animations on? I do. Early passports, like early American driving licenses, did not include a photograph, but rather a standard lexical physical description. This was given the French term signalement, which was, yes, absolutely a callback to Bertillonage. Now, although photographs were made mandatory in passports in 1914, following a spy scandal, signalements continued to be included as late as 1990 in the United Kingdom and can be seen in older passports. And this was my other spoiler. Here is the signalement of a very particular man from 1972, known as Elton John. In a return to the terminology of biometrics, the signalements of passports, the details on American driving licenses, and Bertillonage's characteristics would all be considered multimodal soft biometrics. And now, what I call a biometric data set, the lexical descriptions I call icones. So an icon in Greek is a term used to refer to an image or likeness, whether in the physical realm, something like a picture or a statue, or the imaginary realm, like an image in one's mind, right? But as early as 257 BC in Egypt, icon is used to refer to a physical description. And by the 240s and 230s BC, these lexical descriptions, or icones as I call them, were attached to the names of enslaved and unenslaved persons in a variety of contexts. And in letters, we see writers referencing the writing of icones specifically for the purpose of identification and recognition. Now, throughout the Ptolemaic period, roughly 332 BC to 30 BC, icones were highly descriptive. They included a lot of details like height, skin color, hair texture, face shape, nose shape, impairments, and miscellaneous notations like pierced ear or cleft chin or unibrow. But although they differed from person to person, these descriptions were standardized in order and in vocabulary. And while they used different metrics and characteristics, they may still ring familiar to those of us who hold an American driving license. After the Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BC, the icones changed pretty significantly. The previously detailed descriptions had shrunk to the notation of something called an ule, a bodily marking that's often translated as scar, and its location on the body. Don't worry, no spoilers, I will be talking about that later. This shorter version was by far the most prevalent version of the icon from the first century AD to the 3rd century AD. Aconus, including physical characteristics, were still attested, but just far less frequently. Now, I will say, out of 3,768 aconus, 92 of them included a description with something we can identify as an impairment. And so the identification of a person as able-bodied is only through the absence of an impairment. And it's about those impairments that I will be speaking of today. Now, the use of the word impairment rather than disability here is absolutely 100% intentional. The definition set forth by the Disabled Peoples International, or DPI, distinguishes between the two, defining an impairment as a functional limitation of the body, whereas a disability is the loss or limitation of opportunities within a community as a result of physical impairment. Or, in other words, if you will, although every disability can be directly linked to an impairment, not every single impairment is in fact a disability. I therefore use impairment because the impairments in the aconus were not necessarily disabilities. They were not representative of loss of opportunities, but rather a very practical notation for the purpose of identification. And this brings us to the meat of the talk. This brings us to the impairments as attested in the aconus, in these physical descriptions. A total of 92 aconus, you noted an impairment of some kind, but the distribution between types of impairments was not exactly uniform. The great majority of these were visual impairments, such as cataracts or blindness in one or both eyes. Other impairments included bodily impairments, such as partial paralysis or kyphosis. Notations of auditory and speech-related impairments were rare and, frankly, kind of vague. But what I really want to focus on today is that the notation of these impairments was not intended for social exclusion, but rather that these notations served largely as identification and not much beyond that. Now, these visual impairments, the great majority of them, can be further subdivided. The most common notation were eyes that were hindered, but similar visual impairments include weak eyes, poor eyesight, or powerless eyes. Shaded eyes most likely referred to cataracts, as this term is paralleled also in the medical writings of Galen. White eyes could also refer to cataracts, but equally to glaucoma, which leads to a very distinctive white spot in the pupil. Other notations include a very common description of myopia, nearsightedness, the affliction from which I suffer every single day, and quote-unquote squinting, which could itself be a result of myopia. More rare notations included inflamed eyelids and an individual described as one-eyed. There were also individuals described as well-marked, eusemos. I mean, it literally means well-marked, but it most likely refers to easily identifiable, because these notations were almost always accompanied by some kind of visual impairment. So these people were ones who not only suffered from some kind of visual impairment, but were also easily identifiable by that impairment. The most common bodily impairment noted in the papyri was a word traditionally translated as lame, but I prefer partial paralysis. Now, both due to the ableist connotations of the translation of lame, as well as the fact this Greek word was qualified as affecting a specific limb in the Egyptian papyri. Such partial paralysis could be a result of polio or CP. We have paleopathological evidence of both, so they're both possible. In terms of frequency, partial paralysis is closely followed by a limp, which could be attributed to a number of different causes. A few individuals were described also as bent, which could be the result of scoliosis or alternatively a progression of tuberculosis, a common illness in ancient Egypt, and one in which, again, in paleopathological evidence, we see that it did in fact progress to this curvature of the spine. Absolutely the most unusual description is that of individuals who had gulped fingers. That is the only way to translate that term. This could represent a traumatic injury, a traumatic illness, or injury, a chronic injury, possibly a congenital condition like syndactyly, which is fused digits. It could be any of these things. This does not have any reflection in other sources, so I'm curious to know what they meant by that. Now, I was really interested in finding contemporary parallels to these descriptions, particularly in paleopathology, because there's really hardly a lack of mummified evidence from Egypt, but visual impairments were nearly impossible to ascertain. The eyes are not preserved in mummification. Theoretically, one could recognize very, very severe untreated trachoma that led to death, but no such evidence has ever been found from Egypt. Auditory and speech-related impairments could similarly only be identified if deafness arose from injury, and we have so little evidence textually for deafness that it's also very difficult. But there are certainly parallels to be found for bodily impairments, like this one, bent. All of these conditions listed on the slide were attested on mummified remains from Egypt, as well as on the textual papyrological descriptions. As I said, notations of auditory and speech-related impairments were rare, and even when they appeared, they were pretty vague. A term often translated as deaf/mute is also known as a personal name, and perhaps even used as a derogatory nickname. So it's really unclear if those individuals were indeed impaired in the sense that they were deaf and or mute, or if it was a nickname that was given to them at some point, and perhaps a derogatory one. There is one singular notation of a stammer, though this description is attested only once, and it is on a runaway slave notice, which is problematic in its own right. I don't really have the time to go into detail here. I mean, I could, but we'd be here for another 2 hours. It suffices to say that descriptions of enslaved persons in sale contracts and runaway notices could note details that other contexts did not. And also, suffice to say, part 2, this particular runaway notice is highly unusual and may be a parody of some kind. There are certain impairments that we might expect to encounter in the Iconis because we know they exist in Egypt, whether that comes in the form of physical human remains or in artistic depictions, contemporary ones and preceding ones. That discrepancy may be a matter of preservation in the papyri. Yes, these things were noted, but those papyri haven't lasted to this day. But nevertheless, the absence of these impairments is worthy of note. Paleopathological evidence points to both congenitally missing as well as amputated limbs. Notwithstanding these gulped fingers, which may be missing fingers, there are really no Iconis with missing limbs. And there's also archaeological evidence that people with amputated limbs and digits were given prostheses, which were very likely used in life, and this particular prosthesis was indeed used in life. But assistive aids do not appear in the Iconis, likely because they were not permanent enough to serve as identifiers within the system of Iconis, which is supposed to last you your entire life. Dwarfism in any form is also not mentioned in the Iconis, even though dwarfism is particularly present in Egyptian artistic and textual traditions, and even though achondroblastic dwarfism is a relatively common genetic disorder, which certainly would have aided in the identification of a person. The reason for its absence in the Iconis is unclear. I do think that unlike the other impairments I brought up here, like blindness or partial paralysis or partial blindness, individuals with dwarfism were disabled rather than necessarily just impaired. In other words, their physical impairment restricted their participation in the financial and social transactions for which Iconis were recorded to begin with. And so that may be why they're absent. It may also be just that we have plenty of these papyri, but they just didn't stand the test of time. And lastly, no note of dental work or missing teeth, with an asterisk. I'll come back to that. Dental diseases and treatments were present in Egypt, partly as a result of the coarseness of the diet, which caused extensive wear of tooth enamel. Congenitally missing teeth are also noted in physical remains, along with evidence of dental interventions like surgery or other contraptions, such as this one. But neither missing teeth nor dental work are mentioned in the papyri, and here's where the asterisk comes in. There are 4 attestations of individuals whose identifying mark, their ule, was on their teeth. And so I argued in a very, very recent publication, literally came out 2 days ago, that this could equally refer to an impairment of some kind or of visible dental work. But either way, whatever it was distinctive and permanent enough to serve as identification for the rest of that individual's life. I want to talk about the mummy portraits as artistic evidence of some of the impairments we see in this formal identification. The so-called mummy portraits are realistic portraits of fixed mummies in the Roman period of Egypt. Unlike the more traditional or stereotypical depictions of the deceased, these portraits did not present an idealized version. They really aimed for a depiction which was true to life, and this included both visible signs of aging and any physical impairments that person might have borne evidence of on their face. And early on this project, I discovered the parallel of this man, which really could be a coincidence, or it could not be a coincidence. So as a result of this, I returned to the portraits in search for representations of the impairments present in the papyri of formal identification. Obviously, auditory and speech-related impairments could not be perceptible in portraiture, and the bodily impairments were similarly complicated because these portraits cut off more or less at the neck, so, but I could still search for visual impairments. And that is, of course, exactly what I did. One of the more famous mummy portraits is this one at the Met, titled Youth with a Surgical Cut in His Right Eye. Modern title, but still. This surgical cut was a well-known Roman treatment for trachoma, which could certainly explain the notation of inflamed eyelids in the aconus. Now, blindness and partial blindness were remarkably difficult to ascertain in the portraits, although there is one which may be representative of blindness or partial blindness or cataracts or glaucoma, and this is a man with misshapen pupils and an apparent lack of focus in his eyes. Many portraits depicted elderly persons, and many also depicted light-eyed individuals, but these portraits, the ones with light-eyed individuals, the ones with elderly persons, they all sharply identified and defined the eyes, with only this exception. This portrait could be representative of a number of the visual impairments noted in the papyri, as I said, like glaucoma, like cataracts, and even something like both eyes hindered. So where do the impairments fit into Greco-Roman Egypt? And for that, we must return to the word ule. And it is the singular marker in Roman period Egyptian aconus. The term literally, lexically, means scar. And that's how we see it and know it also from the Odyssey, in which Odysseus is identified by his nurse by virtue of his famous scar. But it can't be scar because 81% of Roman period aconus included the ule and its notation on the notation of its location on the body as the one single identifier for an individual. So I find the translation of scar in all those cases to be pretty highly unlikely. For ule to necessarily refer to a scar in every single attestation, we have to assume that, number one, the majority of Egyptians underwent one single injury in their life that was traumatic enough to leave a permanent scar, and yet somehow not so traumatic that it led to death or disfigurement or bleeding out. And two, that the scar from that injury was so different noticeably different from any other scar they bore. And I just think that's too many assumptions. And importantly, textually, the ule could be replaced or qualified by other identifiers like moles, replaced wholesale by unmarked, or indeed qualified as, yep, an impairment. It really was an identifying mark of any kind, which could technically and theoretically be a scar, but it could also just as well be a mole, a freckle, a body modification, or yeah, an impairment. And the real indicator of this very flexible meaning comes from an early 2nd century AD list of recruits in Latin, which translated ule as ikonismos, the diminutive of akon. So in other words, the image, the description, and the ule of any given person were really one and the same. It was how they were identified, it was how they were viewed, it was their image, it was who they were. And impairments in this context were used as a way to identify a person. So in that sense, they were not so different from any other mark, and it's likely that that was their intent. Persons with impairments were not treated much differently, and neither were they required to have a financial guardian, which it should be noted, all women, able-bodied or otherwise, were indeed required to have a financial guardian at every turn. And even when the iconos began to fade out of common use, the terminology of the descriptions lived on, but again, for practical purposes. So an impaired person for whom written testimony was provided was little different from an illiterate person for whom written testimony was provided. Here, the impairment was provided equally with illiteracy, purely as reasoning for the existence of the second writer. The notation of impairments served as reasoning and, in the corpus of iconos of descriptions, as identification, but importantly, that notation didn't serve as a tool with which to stigmatize differently abled persons. So really, we return to the definition of impairment versus disability. It is clear that contemporary society knew that certain impairments were disabling, leading to, for instance, an exemption from taxes or public labor. And in these contexts, there was an intentional vagueness as to which impairments exactly are the ones that led to an exemption. And this was intentional because it didn't actually matter. What mattered is that certain impairments were disabling. And it was more or less up to A, the impaired person, and B, the bureaucracy to figure out if that impairment was disabling enough. But in contrast, the impairments seen on the iconos were being used for identification alone. So you couldn't be vague. Describing someone as quote unquote disabled may not necessarily lead to a positive identification, but describing someone as paralyzed in one specific limb certainly would. But it is worth noting that these descriptions came with absolutely no further derogation or any kind of subjective qualification about what that impairment implied. And so we come to the title of this talk. My own very expired American driving license came with a restriction. That restriction is, I believe, Article 12, Restriction B, qualified as CORR. That's short for corrective. That means I am so nearsighted that I cannot legally drive without corrective lenses. My impaired vision, my impairment, is noted, but only inasmuch as is required for safe vehicle operation and for the identification of this particular person as Ella Karev, or as the iconos would write it, something like this. Instead of a lexical physical description, there is a photograph, but there is still my height and my weight in addition to the photograph. So we carry on the lexical physical descriptions, the baratonnage, the soft biometrics to this very day. And yes, I do have a hook nose. You just don't see me in profile. As a final note, this often comes as a surprise, but the portrait this one. On the cover of the book is one I painted myself, a way to humanize these descriptions through an artistic medium. He was one of several portraits, including this one, an enterprising young woman and landowner by the name of Eudaimonys, who was recorded, in fact, with what from a modern perspective is a very severe visual impairment, and nonetheless had a very successful life in her own right. If this topic interests you for a further deep dive, there's more in my chapter within that volume, which also contains many, many amazing chapters in their own right. The volume is titled Disability in Ancient Egypt and Egyptology, All Our Yesterdays. So thank you so much for your time, your attention. I look forward to any questions that you have. And if there are questions or comments, please do feel free to reach out to me through my email address. I am available, although I am as slow as any academic to respond, but I will get back to you. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karev. That was a fascinating talk. And on the topic of encouraging questioning, I would like to encourage any of our audience members watching live on YouTube to submit questions or discussion topics in the YouTube Q&A chat. But I'll get us started. I'm going to start with some of the more interpretive aspects of your study because you concluded that the talk with those really amazing paintings that you provided for your book, which are, of course, a matter of interpretation. And I'm really impressed by your artistry, by the way. So, in a somewhat related note, going back to the text themselves, the icones, are they explicitly connected, the descriptions within them, to medical conditions or interpretive perspectives in the notations, or do they serve as physical descriptions and then it's you sort of connecting those dots? So just to remind the audience, you gave some examples like squinting that was connected to myopia. Was that you, or was there a terminology in the icones?
Thank you, Melissa. That's a fantastic question. So things like squinting, usually it is an interpretation, but it comes down to the way that the terminology overlaps with medical writings in Greek, specifically of Galen, although he is not the only one, where myopia is seen as something that is, or rather, this squinting notation is a direct result of myopia, and they do use the same words. There are several ways to depict things like squinting in Greek. Greek loves words, and to use the specific word that is, again, reflected in medical writings for the next 300 years does suggest a connection to myopia. There are certain things that we can't be sure about. For example, shaded eyes. Is that glaucoma? Is that impaired vision? Is that cataract? But then you take a look at this massive 4,000 description database, and it looks like all of the people who have shaded eyes are above the age of 60. So yes, it is absolutely interpretive and it is absolutely subjective, but when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras kind of situation.
Thank you. So I'm also thinking of a comparative corpus of Syrian and Babylonian medical texts, which also, like, there's a huge corpus and a compendium that was put together for diagnostic texts that contains a lot of eye health and eye disease and impairment issues. Did you consult that material at all, or is that context too far outside of your context of essentially Greek and Greco-Roman Egyptian medical perspectives?
I did, although it was actually in complete coincidence, like all good things, I fell into it ass backwards. It's because I'm teaching a course this term on medicine in ancient Egypt. And it got me to thinking about these Babylonian, Assyrian, and basically just general Near Eastern descriptions of eye disease. What we do find a pretty significant parallel for is the description of trachoma. Now, trachoma is a bacterial disease of the eyelids. It's pretty gross. Don't Google it unless you have Safe Search on. And I know we have antibiotics. It's fine. And it affected the ancient Near East significantly. And we see that by the Roman period, yes, they're developing effective surgical treatments for it. So trachoma is one of those things that I did find they almost have developed to the point of a euphemism about it. But to answer your question more directly, I did end up looking at it. There are a lot of shared eye afflictions, most of them having to do with loss of sight or cataracts at an early-ish age that come with increased, what's the word? When you have, when you're, oh my God, my English doesn't fail me often, but this is one of those times when you are.
But anyway, don't worry about it.
No, I'm saying when you have there's more UV radiation in the area where you live, you are more likely to develop cataracts before the age of 60. And that is very, very true in Mesopotamia. It's very, very true in Egypt. And that's what we're seeing is this kind of earlier age at which you develop a cataract. And that is reflected in the Assyrian Babylonian medical texts, as well as the Egyptian medical texts, as well as the Akonis.
Interesting. Aaron, before you jump in, I just want to make a connection to something that Ella raised here. That I could be mistaken, but I believe it was actually also trachoma. That was one of the foci of an eye clinic that was headed up by Olga Tefnel at Lachish in the mid 20th century. And this there's a talk about this presented in an earlier series, also hosted by Archaeological Research Facility and the Bade Museum by Jack Green.
Oh, wow.
And so it's interesting that these eye diseases not only remained prevalent, but through the 20th century and requiring a lot of pretty active intervention, and was prevalent enough for someone like Olga Tefnel, who was not trained in medicine, to really take the helm to try to help solve some of these issues that were still really impacting the local communities.
Trachoma is still a problem today, particularly in communities with problems with hygiene and hygienic water access, because it is very, very resistant. And so it's super interesting to see the way that it was received in a time when there were antibiotics available, and yet it is still an issue that we discuss. This isn't smallpox. It's not eradicated. This is still something we deal with, and many communities deal with, and it is worth addressing. And to see it from papyri from 3,000 years ago, but also to see it today is kind of the crux of my own research.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, Aaron, you had some questions.
Sure. Thanks, Melissa. I have two specific ones. I'll start with the more specific, and then I'll do the more general one, if I can remember. But in one of your last slides, you translated a technical Greek term as honey-colored. And I wanted to ask if there are other color descriptors in your corpus. And if so, how would you translate those terms?
Great question. I urge you to look out for the next 3 articles that are in press about this. So really, there were 3 colors you could be in Ptolemaic and Roman Egypt, which is black, white, or honey. And the overwhelming majority were honey. And by overwhelming majority, I mean 78% of the population was described as honey-colored. And this is basically throwing a wrench in the whole black equals African, white equals European idea, because they really didn't see it that way. There were Nubians who were described as honey colored. There were Egyptians who were described as black and as white. There is no black and white. This was, you were either honey colored, which is to say medium beige, and then you were darker than that, or you were lighter than that. And there was no racial alignment. And I also did cross-reference all of the ethnicons, which is the ethnic origins of people, with these color identifiers. And there's basically there's no uniformity at all. I mean, the only uniformity you see is that blue eyes are not listed with black skin, but you also see people with honey color and frizzled or very tightly curled hair and snub noses, and they're honey colored or they're white, quote unquote, right? You see people who are Black, but they have straight noses and straight hair, and they're also Thracian. They didn't really see it at all as something that qualified an ethnic origin, but really something that qualified, yeah, how dark are you? Are you darker than everyone else, lighter than everyone else, or about the same color as everyone else? Because that's all that matters. And the idea that people can be split into colors along racial, quote unquote, pseudo-racial ethnic lines is very 18th, 17th century AD. And so that is absolutely something that I was incredibly interested in. And it is hugely problematic because people who have researched this in the past, there's a very famous article by a man who I will not dirty his name, but he did translate honey colored as light colored. And I found that really problematic because if you can read Greek and you see melichloros, that can only be one thing. That is honey colored. That is the same meli that you see in diabetes mellitus. And yet he chose to translate as honey colored when talking about translate as light colored when talking about a specific sect of the population. And I think that leads to a lot of assumptions. And so,
so his translation choice was a racialized choice.
I believe so. And now it was 1993, and I know that there was, as is today, as is always, a racialized element to categorizing people under a certain color of skin, but it should be noted that is not how the Egyptians saw themselves. And if we were to talk about Cleopatra, about whom there is no lack of discussion about, well, was she Black? Was she white? Can we cast Gal Gadot as Cleopatra? And it's like, well, statistically speaking, she would have been honey colored with straight hair and a straight nose. And that is all I can tell you.
Wow.
If she looked like her contemporaries in first century BC.
It also demonstrates to us how scholarship in that deals with race among classicists or Greek language folks needs to be taken to task, I would say.
Absolutely. Race and disability / impairment, these are things that need to be treated with the utmost care and sensitivity, because the way that we translate these terms, there's a reason I don't use the word lame. Yes, that's what it says in the dictionary when you look up that specific term, but they were not lame. They were paralyzed in a limb. It was a way with which to identify them. For this specific context, it doesn't make sense to use a very 19th century disabling metaphor.
Wow.
But translation is imperfect.
And just again, a follow-up question. So how would the DPI, what language would it use instead of lame?
Impaired, this particular word, it's definition B is paralyzed, and so that is how it continued to be used well into the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, that particular term. And so that is why I chose paralysis. There is a pretty good definition of this particular term to indicate that being lame in a limb meant that you could not use that limb any longer. And that is why I chose paralysis, because it seemed the closest to what the Greco-Roman Egyptians meant when they were using that term.
Wow. And really, thank you, because your research highlights, what am I trying to say? It highlights the importance of careful translation and really bolsters the thoroughness of the considerations that you take when you translate, a single term. So.
Yeah, I mean, the words we use matter, and that takes to this day that it matters if we call someone impaired, it matters if we call someone disabled, that catches differently in our ears. And I think that matters as much, that mattered as much back then as it matters to us now.
Yeah. So a quick follow-up, well, maybe not quick, but a follow-up question, because you, of course, presented wonderful, textual evidence amazing artistic or iconographic evidence. But I think there was only one artifact that you showed, which was the prosthetic toe or big toe. And so I'm wondering if you might just list a handful of other artifacts that, again, either support your terms or are indicative of our theme of disability.
Oh, I'd be absolutely honored to. Although I do urge anyone interested in this to look at that volume,
Sure.
the Morris and Vogel volume. They all are yesterday's disability in Egyptology and ancient Egypt, or the other way around, ancient Egypt and Egyptology, because there's so much discussed in there, and like the New Kingdom and all these periods that I'm less focused on. However, for instance, we see so many pictographic descriptions of depictions of dwarfism, of polio, and the kind of distinctive partial paralysis in the lower limbs that is indicative of poliomyelitis, and the use of walking canes being not a, something that embarrasses you, but something that is just a part of your life. And this, the particular person I'm thinking of is this, I think, late New Kingdom stele of a man named Roma. And he had a very distinctive, so distinctive paralysis of one of his feet from poliomyelitis that we can recognize it in modern day images of persons who have been afflicted. And he was with a walking cane. He chose to have his funerary stela show him as he was in life, with a walking stick, with a foot that one might call deformed, but really was just a part of who he was. And he still had a very rich life, and he had a very active job as a doorkeeper. There is just an absolute wealth of material and textual and pictographic artistic evidence of people with impairments and what we might call disabilities in the ancient world, and specifically in Egypt, that although they were not perfect in the way that the afterlife would want them to be, they nonetheless led very full and happy lives, and chose that in the depictions that their soul would see after their death, right? Funerary stele, depictions like of the person with dwarfism I showed earlier, they really had no problem depicting themselves as they were in life, because the life they had was quite good, right? So they were like, yeah, this is what I looked like. I had dwarfism. I had a foot that was paralyzed. And I think that is why we see this very unique phenomenon in Egypt of these Greco-Roman papyri, where they're noting almost objectively, almost as a matter of fact, that they were paralyzed or blind in one eye, or had one eye. They had no problem noting these impairments because none of their ancestors had a problem with it, even though it was ideologically not cool. They were completely fine saying, this was my life. It was a good one. I was successful. And if you want to identify me, whether it's after I die or whether it's to pay the census during the late Ptolemaic period, you want to identify me? I'm blind in one eye. Go for it. But you should know this about me. You want to find my Ba wants to find me after I die. You should know I have one foot that is paralyzed by polio. Fight me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm going to yield the floor back to Melissa to see if there are any more questions that she has to pose. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, actually, I want to pull on some of these threads. The topic you're just talking about, and getting back a little bit to what we had been discussing about in descriptive language and interpretation, to understand a bit better how the physical descriptions in the icones would be noted. So who was making them? Did they originate from self-descriptions provided by individuals, or observed characteristics that were highly individualized from the perspective of the official or the scribe?
It's a really good question. Unfortunately, it took me roughly 500 pages to answer that question. Although I do urge you to buy the book. No, but so we know that it is something that was self-reported but noted by the scribes because of the right-left discrepancy, in the sense that it is not, my right arm is hurt. And then the scribe would say, her left arm is hurt. No, it was always right arm, in the sense that it was the person reporting. But in the same way that your doctor would say, if you came into your doctor and said, my right arm hurts, they would say, patient reports right arm hurts. They wouldn't look at you and say, it looks to me like that's the left arm that's hurt from my perspective, right? So there was a lot of thought put into this. There is no judginess in the iconus. And, normally you would hear that and say, well, okay, you don't really know, but, I read 4,000 of them, and they're all so objective in the things they report, from everything to short to medium height to tall to honey colored, black colored, white colored to a hook nosed, snub nosed, straight nosed. There is absolutely no subjective statement on any one of these traits, except that they are traits. And what really rings true to me about those is that they all come in the same order. I mean, it is absolutely, at the DMV, they're not looking at you sideways because you reported that you had brown eyes, not green eyes. And it kind of felt like that in a lot of ways. It was reported recently, about 3 or 4 years ago, that roughly 70% of people lie when reporting their height and weight on their driver's license. And I will say that is not true in several states in which I did have to step on a scale and also get measured. But I digress. The point is, they were not really interested in attaching any kind of statement to these beyond like, can we identify you? How can we identify you? And one of those ways to identify you was if you do have a limp, if you are short, if you do have a straight nose. And I think that very much extends to impairments as well. Even if the scribe felt, or the bureaucracy felt a certain way about limping people or blind people, it didn't really matter. What they needed to do was make sure this was properly noted with the same words in the same order with the correct terminology, so that someone higher up wouldn't get them in trouble when they said, well, you said this guy can't see this guy can't see crap, as opposed to blind in one right eye. I think it was much more important to keep the bureaucracy of the late Ptolemaic and early Roman period going than it was to make subjective statements about what that meant to a scribe, an administrator, or even the person themselves.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really also interesting just from a data collection perspective that the bureaucracy did function in such a highly standardized way that all of these different scribes and officials were in fact using the same terminology so that it was mutually intelligible, and whoever was referencing is presumably be a different person, maybe trying to verify one's identity than the person who originally took the description. But to make the system work, they knew what they had to do. And yeah, it's interesting.
And they talked about it.
Oh yeah, about the terminology usage.
Oh yes. So not only is this something that is noted in this rhetoric account of the much later periods, where they're like, here, if you're in court, here's how you have to describe the person who is accused of a crime. And then they give the exact same characteristics in the same order of the iconus. This was something they talked about, they recognized, they knew, and there's very few non-Greek descriptions, which is to say like the same description, but translated into Demotic or Latin. There's very, very few. I mean, out of 4,000, there's probably 24. And yet all of the people who were writing the non-Greek iconus were talking to each other, and they were family members. So these were people who were like, what does hollow-eyed mean? Should we just like translate that literally, or does it mean something else? And it's most apparent in the description of something of the mole, actually, which in Greek is a word that literally means lentil, because most moles are shaped like lentils. I think we're all pretty familiar with that, except there were some scribes who looked at that and thought, Right. They wrote lentil. I will write lentil, even though in Latin it doesn't make any sense to call a mole a lentil. Don't worry about it. And there were some scribes who said, no, that's quite wrong, actually. And I know they're referring to a lentil in Greek, so I'm going to translate that as a mole because that's what they're talking about. So they were definitely talking about the way that these things can be portrayed and shown in formal identification, because it was important, just like Bertillonage, to use the same terms, because otherwise it's all kind of moot, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, sounds like a pretty highly functioning complex bureaucracy.
I would say so.
And we are basically at time now, so I think we can wrap it up on that note. So I would like to ask everyone to join us in very warmly thanking today's speaker, Dr. Ella Karev, for sharing her research, and go and buy her book. The next talk in this series will be held on February 19th at 9:30 Pacific, featuring Dr. Rachel Kalisher, who will be sharing a talk titled Brothers of Misfortune, A Story of Wealth and Health at Ancient Megiddo. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.
Thank you very much.